The Lipton chapter asks us to think about visual culture. And I say visual culture specifically because we should draw a distinction here between um, a way of thinking in a scholarly manner about images versus a category like art. Lipton uses the term art herself. I think actually it's problematic because art is actually a really kind of late way of thinking about why we make images, who makes them, and whether they're acceptable. So if we say visual culture, then we're not necessarily talking about a way of understanding what images are, but rather the use of images in people's lives. So, one of the really important things when we're thinking about visual culture is to understand that interpretation, as she emphasizes, is something that's done not by the artist, but by viewers, right? So, with these different depictions of the crucifixion, we we can know a couple things. One, that whatever the artist thought, that has an important influence. But the whole reason that she even gives us these verbal texts describing how different types of people understood Jesus is to show that it really depends on the audience as to how people are interested in different depictions of Jesus, and how they might understand them, right? So we're trying to do something really hard. We're trying to imagine when a medieval Christian saw a crucifix, what did it mean to them, right? And so we don't have a lot of sources from everyday people. So we can only kind of do our best with what we do have. So that's why she turns to different types of sources and very different audiences. That she has a meditation from a monk and a theologian. She discusses crusaders, people who were men who were soldiers, right? So both their gender and their occupation play a major role, and in particular, the fact that they're participating in the Crusades. The Crusades were a series of wars initiated by Christian Europe in an attempt to take back Jerusalem and the land of Israel from Muslim control. By and large, they were unsuccessful, although there was a period of time where Christians had much more control than they had ever had. But importantly, in kind of this anti Muslim crusade, a lot of crusaders tended to also express anti Jewish feelings, and there was a tremendous amount of anti Jewish violence because basically, as they traveled from Europe into the Middle East, they encountered a lot of different people, and so on the way to Muslim Palestine, Muslim land of Israel, Jews suffered a lot throughout the Crusades. Okay, so we have an example of a theologian, we have an example of crusade warriors who see Jesus as a warrior too. But we also have an example of how Jews viewed Jesus, which is very different, right? That it's not only about the theological difference. This is just a dead body to Jews versus this is God personified, um, making right for all human sins in Christian theology. It is a matter of theology, absolutely, but there's also this larger context happening of the Crusades throughout this part of the medieval era. So when Jews from that time period describe crucified Jesus as just a rotting corpse, that this is meant to denigrate Christianity, and it is part of a more holistic response to the outbreak of violence against Jews. And it also was a time period when Jews were beginning to be expelled or required to wear certain items, that there's really rampant, violent, threatening anti-Semitism in Western Europe in this time period. So when we're thinking about what Lipton means, we have to think about how it means trying, by seeing infuse with imagination, it means trying to think about how would viewers have imagined the crucifixion in front of them. So people pointed out a lot of really good examples for how to see this. The difference between seeing Jesus' head as sagging or seeing him as purposefully leaning forward, right? Those are two very different understandings. And it also has to do with not just the visual representation, but what was the theological emphasis. So people noted that in the earlier image and time period around the 10th century, that generally Christians really emphasized the idea of love when they saw the crucifixion, of Jesus' willingness to die as an act of love. But more and more throughout the medieval period, Christians and Christian theologians began to emphasize it as a sacrifice and as suffering. And so the idea of suffering was understood to be really, really meaningful for Christians to truly appreciate what Jesus had done. So we see a transformation in how Jesus is depicted from a almost not quite human, giant eyes, active body, versus later emaciated body, sagging sort of core and shoulders, those kinds of things, that these are, maybe at first glance, if we don't know that much about Christianity, they are very, very similar depictions. I certainly know that before reading this kind of research, when I would go to, say, a museum that had a room full of different crucifixes, I didn't know how to understand what was meaningful about them. But sort of having this kind of guide to seeing, okay, there's change over time in how medieval Christians tended to depict Jesus. And there's actually a lot that we can recover for how they fit that into the meaning in their lives. Then we can start to really pick out those differences, right? So, this depiction of love, it's not that we Christians couldn't see love in the crucifix even to go along with suffering. Of course, that's possible. But this older version really kind of emphasizes love and even Jesus' divinity, right? Because to be crucified was a very common punishment in Rome, that if someone was executed, it was very frequent that they would be crucified. The way the crucifixion worked is that people would be nailed to a cross. Importantly, it's not usually depicted this way. It's often depicted with the nails in Jesus' hand, but that actually doesn't work, because the nail would rip right through this pretty flimsy flesh. The crucifixion, the nail would have had to go here in someone's wrists, and actually, in linguistically, there's no distinction between a wrist and a hand in some of the older languages that are important. Okay, so it's excruciating to be nailed up, but then ultimately the way that the execution worked was by suffocation. That basically, by placing someone like this and giving them just something very small for their feet, or nailing their feet to the cross as well, they would have to lift their body up, because only by lifting could they get any air into their lungs. And so the process of death was one of slowly becoming too weak to continue to lift their body up. So we note that to think about how impossible it would have been for a human to just kind of graciously and sweetly lean their head, right? That this is a way of reading the crucifixion that kind of reimagines what's happening in the ends to the Gospels that describe Jesus' life. And it's through other texts. So we saw the reference to Canticles 1. That's another way of referring to the Song of Songs. And so I think I want to just end by reading how it was possible to see Jesus in a different light precisely because of other texts that are in the Christian Bible. So from the Christian Old Testament, what we might call the Hebrew Bible, the shared text with Judaism, that in the Song of Songs, it says, "Give me the kisses of your mouth, for your love is more delightful than wine. Your ointments yield a sweet fragrance. Your name is like finest oil." And it goes on to describe what has been interpreted to be sort of seeking God's love, or God seeking humans' love, in these very erotic language. So there's really an important difference between erotic and sexual. That erotic is symbolic, that we shouldn't think that monks were kind of sitting around in the medieval period hoping to like make out with Jesus. That's not what was up. But rather they were seeing the crucifixion through the lens of other texts that were very important. And so the Song of Songs, in describing God as the beloved and in talking about kisses and things like that, lent a kind of language to Christianity that had really lasting effects, in particular on mysticism, in particular on the language that Christians used to describe some kind of direct experience with God.